Jessica Carter adjusted the sleeves of her well-worn denim jacket as she strolled past the towering buildings of San Francisco's financial district. The late October air carried a brisk chill, mingling with the scent of salt water drifting in from the bay. At 35, Jessica looked nothing like the kind of woman you'd expect to see in designer heels or dripping in diamonds. Her style was simple, rooted in comfort, not couture. And though she had access to every luxury imaginable, thanks to her billionaire husband Nathaniel Carter, Jessica never saw the need to change who she was. She glanced at her watch. Still nearly 2 hours until Nathaniel would join her. It was their 5th wedding anniversary, and like every year before, she spent the afternoon walking alone through the city she'd grown to love. Nathaniel, always busy finalizing some high-stakes investment deal, promised to meet her later at Lumiere, their anniversary restaurant tradition. But this year, they were trying a new location, Lumiere downtown, an opulent new branch in the heart of the city. "Thought we'd do something different this time," he had said, flashing that same warm smile that had first drawn her in years ago. Their love story wasn't one of glamour, but of sincerity. Jessica, a children's book illustrator from Minneapolis, had first met Nathaniel at a fundraiser for early literacy. Back then, she was just another woman with paint on her hands and a dream in her heart. Nathaniel, despite being one of the city's most eligible bachelors, was immediately captivated by her honesty and passion. "I don't care what you wear," he told her on their first date. "I care about the woman who makes stories come to life." 5 years later, that same woman still drove her aging Volvo, shopped at the farmer's market every Saturday, and wore her natural curls with pride. Her lifestyle hadn't changed, even though her zip code had. She never felt the need to prove anything to anyone. And on this special day, she carried with her a small gift, a vintage watch she'd found in a tucked-away antique shop. It wasn't flashy, but it meant something. On the back, she'd had it engraved with the coordinates of the place where their story began. As she approached the gleaming entrance of Lumiere, Jessica took a deep breath. The glass doors sparkled under the city lights. Behind them, she saw glittering chandeliers, tuxedoed waiters, and tables dressed in fine linens. She adjusted her jacket and stepped forward, not knowing that what awaited her inside was not just a dinner reservation, but a lesson in judgment, dignity, and the quiet power of authenticity. The moment Jessica Carter stepped into Lumiere's grand foyer, she knew something was off. The air inside was heavy with the scent of imported lilies and ambition. Crystal chandeliers sparkled like constellations above crisp white tablecloths and polished silverware. It was a place designed to impress, and to intimidate. She approached the host's stand with a polite smile, but the blonde woman behind the desk, name tag reading Brittany, didn't smile back. Her eyes did a slow scan from Jessica's denim jacket to her sensible shoes. "Can I help you?" she asked, her tone coated in suspicion. "I have a reservation under Nathaniel Carter." 7 o'clock, Jessica replied calmly. Brittany raised an eyebrow and tapped on her sleek digital tablet. "Yes, I see it," she said, pausing just long enough to imply disbelief. "But it's only 5:15. The bar is for seated guests only. Perhaps you'd be more comfortable at the cafe down the street?" Jessica's posture straightened. She wasn't new to subtle exclusion. "Actually, I'd like to wait here. A drink at the bar would be nice." With a strained smile, Brittany gestured toward a cramped table tucked beside the kitchen doors, far from the elegant window seating. "Of course. Right this way." As Jessica took her seat, she noticed the sideways glances from staff polishing glasses and rearranging cutlery. A waiter named Dylan approached, clearly amused. "Water," he offered, the word laced with judgment. "Gin and tonic, please," she answered, her voice steady. Dylan hesitated, then asked for a credit card before walking off with her order. Jessica recognized the game. This wasn't about drinks or reservations, it was about who they thought she was. And in their eyes, she didn't belong. A group of servers lingered nearby, whispering behind menus and cocktail shakers. One of them, Ashley, passed Jessica's table and commented under her breath, "Some women will marry anyone for money." Another waiter, Jamal, chuckled and added, "You'd think Mr. Carter could have upgraded her wardrobe." Jessica felt the heat rise in her cheeks but didn't react. She'd heard similar remarks before, at charity galas, corporate dinners, even casual events. It always came down to appearances. They didn't see a woman with talent and character. They saw a denim jacket and drew their own conclusions. She pulled her phone from her purse and opened a photo of her and Nathaniel, laughing on a beach in Cape Cod. That was their world, real, unfiltered, and free from this kind of elitist nonsense. The bartender returned with a watered-down gin and tonic. Jessica thanked him anyway. She wasn't here to fight. She was here to celebrate love. Still, a small voice inside her whispered, "They have no idea who they're dealing with." But they will. As the clock inched towards 6, the tone inside Lumiere shifted from discreet dismissal to open ridicule. Jessica Carter, still seated near the kitchen doors, had become the evening's unspoken entertainment. She noticed it in the exaggerated glances, the not-so-subtle smirks, and the growing number of servers drifting past her table with no real purpose, just to gawk. Ashley, the blonde server from earlier, returned with a grin so artificial it practically glowed. "Is everything all right over here?" she asked loudly, drawing attention from nearby staff. "We do have a coat check, you know, if you prefer to freshen up your look." Before Jessica could respond, Jamal, a young man with copper-toned hair and too much confidence, passed by and added, "I bet that jacket's got a great thrift store story." Jessica took a long sip of her diluted drink and met Ashley's gaze squarely. "I'm perfectly comfortable, thank you." They walked away laughing, oblivious to the dignity with which she held herself. The restaurant had started filling with early diners now, well-dressed couples, business executives, and a few recognizable faces from society pages. Jessica could feel their eyes on her too. Some were curious, others confused. A few even mirrored the staff's condescension, silently questioning what this plainly dressed woman was doing in a place like this. It wasn't just about clothes. It was about status, perception, and a deep-seated assumption that wealth looks a certain way. And Jessica, a black woman in denim and natural curls, simply didn't fit their picture of affluence. Dylan returned to check on her drink with a forced smile. "Still waiting?" he asked, as if she'd wandered in off the street and forgotten her place. "You know, there's a more casual spot down the block that might be more suitable." Jessica looked up, her voice calm but clear. "I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be." The whispering intensified behind the bar. Someone mentioned the name Nathaniel Carter with an incredulous chuckle. Another voice joked, "Yeah right," as if she landed him. Jessica glanced at her watch. Still an hour to go. And every second was sharpening her resolve. She'd seen this kind of behavior before, not just as a wife of wealth, but as a woman of color navigating elite spaces that weren't built to welcome her. This wasn't the first time she'd been underestimated. But it might be the most public. She smoothed her napkin across her lap and lifted her chin. She didn't come for their approval. She came for her anniversary. And when Nathaniel walked through that door, every one of them would remember her face, not because of what she wore, but because of the way she carried herself despite their sneers. They had made a mistake. And they were about to find out just how big it was. At 6:30 p.m., Jessica Carter was still seated by the kitchen doors, sipping her second, properly made, gin and tonic. The drink had arrived with a slightly more respectful tone after she requested Hendrick's gin and a cucumber garnish, clearly signaling to the staff that she knew what she was talking about. Still, the atmosphere hadn't improved much. The laughter had become more muffled, but the sneers and sideways glances hadn't disappeared. Then, just as Jessica was checking the time again, a refined older woman in a navy blue dress and a strand of pearls rose from a nearby table. She crossed the dining room with the ease of someone who had long been comfortable in places like this. When she stopped in front of Jessica's table, her voice rang out with gentle warmth. "Jessica?" "Jessica Carter," the woman asked. Jessica looked up, momentarily surprised. Then her face lit with recognition. "Mrs. Thompson?" It was Evelyn Thompson, chairwoman of the Children's Literacy Foundation, and one of the most respected philanthropic voices in the city. She had been there when Jessica and Nathaniel first met during a fundraiser years ago. Evelyn turned to the nearby restaurant manager, Mr. Edward Blake, who had been watching the exchange from a distance, and beckoned him over. "Mr. Blake," she said crisply, "do you know who this is?" "This is Jessica Carter, a treasured supporter of our foundation. She and her husband, Nathaniel Carter, funded the entire children's wing of the San Francisco Public Library last year." Jessica watched the color drain from Edward's face. His forced calm gave way to visible discomfort. I wasn't aware," he stammered. "Well, you are now," Evelyn said firmly. "I trust you're taking good care of her." Edward nodded, eyes darting between Jessica and the service station where servers had frozen mid-task. "Of course, Mrs. Thompson. We value all of our guests." Jessica offered a polite smile. "I'm fine right where I am, thank you." She could sense the ripple moving through the room. Patrons who had stared earlier were now whispering for different reasons. Servers who had laughed behind her back were now whispering among themselves with pale expressions and stolen glances. A young server who hadn't been involved in the earlier mistreatment quietly approached Jessica and set down a small plate of hors d'oeuvres. "Compliments of the chef, Mrs. Carter," she said softly. "I'm very sorry." Jessica gave her a nod of gratitude. The tide had begun to turn, not because Jessica had demanded it, but because someone who mattered to their world had acknowledged who she was. It was a moment of poetic justice. And still, the most dramatic revelation of the night hadn't even happened yet. At precisely 7 p.m., the heavy glass doors of Lumiere swung open. The staff who had once mocked and giggled now stood frozen behind the bar and service stations. Heads turned throughout the restaurant as a tall, distinguished man stepped inside, broad-shouldered, dressed in a perfectly tailored charcoal gray suit, his silver-streaked hair combed neatly back. It was Nathaniel Carter. To many in San Francisco's financial world, Nathaniel needed no introduction. He was known not only for his vast fortune and shrewd investments, but for his quiet integrity and consistent support of causes like education and affordable housing. He had long ago proven that decency and power could coexist. As he entered, Brittany, the same hostess who had turned Jessica away hours earlier, rushed forward, her smile now stretched awkwardly to full capacity. "Good evening, Mr. Carter. Welcome to Lumiere." Nathaniel nodded politely. "Thank you. My wife arrived early." "Jessica Carter," she texted that she's already seated. For a moment, Brittany looked as though she had swallowed ice. Her eyes darted across the room until they landed on Jessica's table near the kitchen. "Of course, sir. Right this way." As Nathaniel followed her, guests whispered, eyebrows raised. Some recognized him. Some recognized her. and others were just beginning to piece it all together. Jessica looked up, smiling as her husband approached. "There's my girl," Nathaniel said warmly. He leaned down to kiss her cheek, then pulled out the chair opposite hers and sat down as if it were the most natural thing in the world. "You're right on time," Jessica said softly. "Traffic was a bear," he replied, glancing around the restaurant. "But I made it. Everything okay?" Before Jessica could answer, Edward Blake, the flustered general manager, materialized beside their table. "Mr. Carter, welcome to Lumiere. We're honored by your presence this evening. I hope your wife's wait wasn't too inconvenient." Jessica's eyes remained steady, her voice calm. "It was enlightening." Nathaniel's gaze moved to the table's location. He immediately noted their position, tucked against the service corridor, far from the scenic windows. "I requested a window seat when I made the reservation," he said evenly. "Yes, sir." "I'm terribly sorry, there must have been a mix-up," Edward offered. "We'd be happy to relocate you now." "That won't be necessary," Nathaniel replied. "My wife seems perfectly settled." Then, turning slightly in his chair, Nathaniel added, "Would you mind calling over the staff who were assisting my wife while she waited? I'd like to thank them personally." It wasn't a request. It was a cue. Edward hesitated, then nodded stiffly. "Of course, sir." And as he walked off to gather the very employees who had spent the last 2 hours sneering, gossiping, and underestimating, Jessica gently laced her fingers with Nathaniel's. "They think the worst is over," she murmured. Nathaniel gave her a knowing smile. "Then they're in for one more surprise." Moments later, Edward returned, his expression a strained blend of politeness and panic. Trailing behind him were Brittany, Dylan, Ashley, and Jamal, the same four who had laughed, whispered, and misjudged. Gone were the confident strides and mocking smirks. Now, their shoulders sagged slightly, and their eyes darted toward the floor. "Mr. Carter," Edward began, voice tight, "these are the team members who were assisting Mrs. Carter this evening." Nathaniel stood, slowly and deliberately. He looked each of them in the eye, pausing just long enough to let the silence speak. "I'd like to ask," he began, his tone calm but firm, "how my wife was treated during her wait." Brittany opened her mouth, perhaps to spin a story, but Jessica raised her hand gently. "I'd rather speak to that," she said. She turned to the group. "Earlier this evening, I was told the bar was reserved, even though it was empty. I was directed to a table by the kitchen, served a drink with clear disdain, and overheard more than a few comments about my appearance and supposed intentions." Dylan cleared his throat nervously. "Mrs. Carter, we didn't mean." "But you did," Nathaniel cut in. His voice, though even, carried unmistakable weight. "You meant every smirk, every whispered insult. You assumed my wife couldn't possibly belong here because she didn't dress the way you expected." Ashley's cheeks flushed deep red, and Jamal looked visibly shaken. Edward began, "Mr. Carter, please understand, this isn't how we train our staff." "No," Nathaniel interrupted, reaching into his inner suit pocket and retrieving his phone. He tapped a few times, then turned the screen toward Edward. "This is a confirmation email. As of this afternoon, my firm finalized acquisition of a controlling interest, 60%, in the Lumiere Restaurant Group." Silence rippled across the dining room like a wave. "So," he continued, "the staff you've allowed to judge and belittle paying guests just insulted the wife of their new employer." Mouths fell open. Patrons gasped. Brittany visibly trembled. Jessica, however, remained seated, poised and calm. "We're not here to punish," she said, voice steady. "We're here to celebrate our anniversary." I've endured worse in life than poor service. What's disappointing is how predictable your behavior was." Nathaniel nodded. "We won't be moving to the window seat. We'll eat here, as a reminder. Not to us, but to you." He sat back down, reaching for Jessica's hand again. "I believe this restaurant has a chance to be better," she added. "But only if it learns what real class looks like." And with that, the Carters ordered their dinner, still by the kitchen, still under watchful eyes, but now with a different energy in the room. It was no longer about status. It was about a lesson learned the hard way, and by the right people. As the Carters settled into their dinner, the energy in the restaurant was palpably different. The same servers who had once eyed Jessica Carter with disdain now tiptoed around her with careful reverence. Conversations in the dining room had quieted. Everyone seemed to sense they were witnessing something more than a fancy meal. It was a real-time reckoning. Edward Blake, still flustered, hovered nearby, eager to please. He personally oversaw every course that arrived at their table. From the truffle bisque starter to the seared halibut entree, everything was served with the precision of a five-star kitchen, and the nerves of a teen walking on eggshells. Jessica noticed the change but didn't gloat. She had no interest in vengeance, only in awareness. Her presence, once dismissed, now commanded a kind of quiet respect. Not because she had raised her voice, but because she hadn't. Across the room, Brittany, Ashley, Dylan, and Jamal stood clustered at the service station. They weren't laughing anymore. Edward had spoken to them, firmly and publicly. They had been reminded that good service doesn't start with designer labels or polished shoes, it begins with humility. "Would you like to move to the window table now, ma'am?" Edward asked again, his voice softer. Jessica smiled and shook her head. "We're fine here. I'd rather experience your restaurant as it really is." Nathaniel, cutting into his medium-rare filet, nodded approvingly. "You handled this with more grace than I would have," he said. Jessica tilted her head. "People don't grow when they're punished. They grow when they're made to see clearly. And tonight," she added, glancing around the room, "I think a few people have finally started to see." Dessert arrived, a delicate trio of creme brulee, chocolate torte, and lemon sorbet. Jessica took a spoonful of the torte and smiled. "Delicious," she said, loud enough for the nearby staff to hear. She wasn't cruel. She wanted them to know they still had a chance to get it right. From the corner of her eye, she noticed Ashley walking toward their table. Her expression was sheepish, but sincere. "Mrs. Carter," she began, her voice almost a whisper. "I want to say I'm sorry. I judged you. We all did. And we were wrong." Jessica nodded slowly. "Thank you for saying that. I hope tonight reminds you that kindness costs nothing, but means everything." Ashley blinked, then turned away. As the Carters sipped coffee and watched the final sunlight fade behind the San Francisco skyline, they knew this anniversary would be remembered not for the food or the view, but for the truth it revealed and the growth it might inspire. As the final course was cleared and coffee cups were refilled, the atmosphere inside Lumiere had transformed entirely. Jessica Carter, once the subject of snickers and judgment, now occupied a space that commanded quiet reverence, not because of status or money, but because of the dignity with which she carried herself. Nathaniel leaned across the table, placing his hand gently over hers. "Happy anniversary, my love." Jessica smiled, reaching into her jacket pocket and pulling out a small, square box wrapped in soft burgundy paper. "I almost forgot, with everything that happened tonight," she said. "This is for you." Nathaniel opened it slowly, revealing a vintage watch, clean lines, classic face, understated elegance. On the back was an inscription, the exact coordinates of the small publishing house where they had first met. He turned the watch over in his hands and cleared his throat. "It's perfect," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Just like you." Their moment was simple, yet profound. There were no grand gestures, no fireworks, just two people who knew what truly mattered in life: respect, loyalty, and the ability to see the soul beneath the surface. As they rose to leave, Edward and the remaining staff formed a quiet line by the exit. Brittany, Dylan, Ashley, and Jamal stood among them, no longer prideful, but humbled. Each gave a small nod as the Carters passed. Jessica paused briefly in front of them. Her voice was soft but steady. "I hope you remember," she said, "that true worth isn't always wrapped in designer labels. And real class doesn't speak loudly, it shows up quietly, in how we treat one another." There was no anger in her tone, only grace. It wasn't just a correction, it was a parting gift. A second chance. Outside, as the valet brought around their car, Nathaniel slipped his arm around Jessica's shoulders. The lights of the city shimmered across the pavement. A gentle breeze stirred the hem of her jacket. "You okay?" he asked. Jessica leaned into him and smiled. "I'm more than okay. Tonight reminded me of who I am, and of who we are together." Nathaniel kissed her forehead. "I knew exactly who you were the first time I saw you." As they drove away, the quiet hum of the engine was filled not with anger or resentment, but with peace. They hadn't set out to teach a lesson that evening, but the lesson had been taught nonetheless. Back inside, the restaurant staff remained in thoughtful silence. Lumiere would never be quite the same. And neither would they. This story is a reminder that dignity doesn't shout, it stands firm. Jessica Carter's quiet endurance in the face of judgment and mockery revealed a truth often forgotten in our image-obsessed society: appearances are not proof of worth. In a world where people are so often sized up by their clothes, cars, or perceived status, Jessica's grace teaches us that character will always speak louder than couture. For those of us in our later years, this lesson holds particular weight. We've seen trends come and go, wealth rise and fall, and reputations built or broken by public perception. But what lasts, what really matters, is how we treat others, and how we hold ourselves in moments of adversity. Jessica never raised her voice. She didn't retaliate. Instead, she chose self-respect over retaliation, and wisdom over ego. As we age, we have the privilege and responsibility to model this kind of integrity for younger generations. We can remind the world that true class is not about looking the part, but about acting with kindness when it's hardest. Respect is not something demanded, but something earned by how we behave when no one expects us to be strong. The next time you're underestimated, dismissed, or looked past, remember Jessica. Stand tall. Say less. And let your quiet strength do the talking.